Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden, and my co-host, Christina, is in Portland, Oregon this week, again with her ailing mom. Listeners will remember that her mother, who is 92, is not doing so well right now, and Christina had to go a couple weeks ago to be with her, and this past week she had to do so again. I think her mom is now stable, thankfully. But like all or most of us, Christina spent as much time as she could last week, I'm sure, on the bed beside her fiercely Democratic mom, gripped to the television, watching the drama of the Supreme Court hearings for Brett Kavanaugh. I think she agrees with me, as we've talked, that whatever your politics or the reactions you had to the spectacle, I think we can all agree that it's just been so deeply upsetting for so many reasons. But for this podcast, we don't want to get into what is going on or rehash what happened in the hearings, but instead focus on one of the bigger issues that continues. The head of school at Holton Arms, which is the school that Dr. Christina Blasey Ford attended, put it well in an email she wrote to parents right after the day of the testimony. And she asked, how can we help our young people avoid becoming victims or perpetrators of sexual assault? And then Georgetown Prep, the school Kavanaugh attended, issued a statement which said the following: the image that has been presented on social media and in various news outlets depicts recklessness, illegal conduct, and lack of respect for persons. Worse, many blame these faults on institutional indifference. But the temptations and the failings presented in these stories are not unique to Georgetown Prep. The problems and abuses of alcohol and drugs, sexual assault and misconduct, emotional and physical violence toward others are real. And educators at every institution of primary, secondary, or higher learning in our nation face these problems every day. And so this is the question we want to discuss. Let's go beyond the accusations that we heard in the Supreme Court testimony and explore how pervasive these issues remain today, especially amongst boys' schools and in college frats. I mean, is it an elite thing? Is it a sports team thing? Is the behavior confined to a tiny minority, a subculture of mark judges, or is it more widespread? And how should women react and behave? To talk about all of this today will be Emily Yoffe, a return femsplainer, who has written extensively about these types of issues for publications such as The Atlantic and HuffPost Highline. And we'll also bring back our millennial mansplainer, Nat, who attended Landon, one of the Beltway boys' schools you may have heard mentioned last week alongside Georgetown Prep. Nat's, of course, spoken to us before about some of his experiences as a member of a college frat. And in the studio with me now, as a substitute co-splainer for Christina, is lawyer, writer, and great friend Melinda Sidek.
Hi, Danielle.
And given the nature of the topic today, I think we'll make this a cocktail-free episode. So I'm so sorry, Melinda. I know how much you love Manhattans. Melinda is here because Melinda has 4 boys.
4 sons, and they all attended a private religious boys' school, not Georgetown Prep.
But in the district.
In the District of Columbia.
So not only are you a kind of lay expert on boys and boys in private schools, but my son, too, went to an all-boys school in the same area and has interaction with Georgetown Prep. All of these boys' schools have had interaction with each other.
We are in the same sports league as Georgetown Prep. And as a matter of fact, I also dated for 7 years in college a man who graduated from Georgetown Prep.
Okay, so
he was absolutely a perfect gentleman.
I looked this up, that the percentage of students who report binge drinking by grade between 1976 and 2015. And it's really true that between 1978 and 1982 was the absolute high booze mark for drinking amongst high school. This is between 8th, 10th, and 12th grades.
Well, remember that the drinking age was 18 also, so it was much easier.
Right, but even that being said, it was like over 41.4% of 12th graders would binge drink. And now that's down to 17.2. So there have been other factors, but it was a different culture. I mean, I think Mark Judge, who I think of as the Thucydides of frat culture that time, has written that he felt it was very influenced by the Animal House.
That what had already been in place became exponentially worse after the movie Animal House came out. I think to this day, the movie remains very popular, and a lot of younger people sort of emulate.
But tell me about your boys' experience, because they went through from fourth grade onward, right? Third grade onward, they were in an all-boys school?
Yes, they were in an all-boys school, and I have several thoughts about that. There's some debate about, is this some sort of worse issue in private religious boys' school as opposed to, say, public high school? And my perspective is more like it has to do with a sports team issue, that whether you're in a public high school or you are in a private all-boys school, if you are on a sports team, particularly in certain sports like lacrosse, that can foster a culture. I asked my youngest son what he thought was going on, and he sort of stunned me with his answer. His answer
How old is Lachlan? How old?
He has just turned 16. He said that he thought that the locker room atmosphere was somewhat homoerotic, and that the anxieties that give rise to rampant homophobia and misogyny. The vast majority of the boys at these schools, whether public or private, are shy, insecure, unsure how to negotiate the frightening terms of the opposite sex. There are no longer any guidelines for how to approach a girl. There are no guidelines for understanding when she is interested or not. And it's very frightening and confusing, and they're just as intimidated as many girls are. It's really just a handful of bad actors who can often give people a bad name generally. And I always heard stories about these, but again, my 4 sons, I don't know why a couple like my husband and myself would have 4 sons. We should have had 4 daughters because neither of us have any eye-hand coordination to speak of, and we're not really interested in sports at all. So my solution was to push them all into music.
Right, you actually have 4 choir boys, so
yes,
no wonder they're so well behaved.
My sons were literally choir boys, yes, and I pushed them all into music on the theory that the quarterback may get all the girls, but so does the lead guitar player.
Well, actually, I'm going to bring back our mansplainer, Nat Frum, but we'll pretend we're not related because I don't want it to look too much like a family friend affair. But Nat, post this Kavanaugh stuff, just to talk about, to Melinda's question, you were in a frat, you were at this boys' school, we did discuss it before you came on. When you read and hear about what was going on at Georgetown Prep, what was going on at fraternities, what was your experience? What is your reaction to it from that perspective?
First of all, thanks for having me on. I wasn't very surprised regarding the Georgetown Prep stories. I went to Landon for 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, which was mentioned in the New Yorker article, or one of the New Yorker articles about Kavanaugh, and was the rival to Georgetown Prep. In a lot of ways, it was the slightly less affluent, slightly less academically successful rival to Prep. We played them in sports. The lacrosse game and basketball game were always televised throughout the city. And a lot of the culture mentioned in the various articles about Kavanaugh was something I experienced firsthand at Landon, less so in a fraternity. I was in a fraternity in college, but it was a small fraternity at a small school where, while many people at the university were concerned about what we were doing and imagining we were having these wild sex parties, we were actually just playing beer pong and imagining different ways that we could talk to women.
You're fulfilling the Melinda, most boys are just feeling awkward about women theory.
They don't know what to do.
Certainly, I think the DC private schools are a unique place, and the all-boys schools, at least in my experiences, do have these very, very dangerous elements in how men treat women. I'm not sure how familiar you are, but with Landon, there was some pretty national scandals. The Duke lacrosse team, the falsely accused Duke lacrosse team.
This was the Duke University lacrosse case that happened, I think, in 2006 when 3 members of Duke's men's lacrosse team were falsely accused of rape.
Many of the players went to Landon, although they were in a situation in which they were at a fraternity party with a stripper who they all had sex with. George Hughley, the Virginia lacrosse player who murdered his girlfriend, who was also a Virginia lacrosse player, was a Landon graduate. One story that didn't quite make national news but made the Washington Post was the year below me.
What year were you in?
I graduated high school in 2012, so This would have been the class of 2013. And this is the year after I left, but there was a scandal in the school. There was a fantasy football league made by 12 or 15 boys for local girls. And you would draft a team of girls, and they would throw a party every week. Any various sexual acts got a certain amount of points for your team. So you'd have boys trying to get, I mean, I don't want to get too explicit, but a hand job was 10 points, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was found out, and all the boys, I believe, were suspended, but none were expelled, even though this made the Washington Post and was a pretty gross thing to do.
Where are these attitudes towards women coming from? Like, is it just part of the culture? Do you think it comes from their family background?
I think one mistake I see a lot when people are talking about these all-boys schools is they think it's something that's being taught or ingrained by an institution, which I don't agree with. My first few years, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade at Landon were amazing. I think an all-boys school for boys that age were great because you take 12-year-old boys, you remove them from society, you set them loose on a field somewhere, and
like
in 3 or 4 years, when they're responsible members of society, you can bring them back into the world. But what I did notice was it's nearly impossible in that situation, especially at a school in the D.C. area where so many of the parents are very affluent people who have made their money in not such noble ways. Many of them have quote-unquote trophy wives.
I saw that at parents' night.
Yeah. And the
I was not one.
Are all cheating with their assistants, secretaries, what have you. And it's just not a place where it's very easy to teach a genuine respect of women. In fact, I don't remember having a female teacher in middle school and high school. I mean, God bless the young female teachers we had. They were tougher than most people I've ever met, but still dealt with a lot. But it took me, when I switched from 10th grade to a co-ed school, it took me some time to learn how to interact with women in a respectful way, because when you're at an all-boys school, you only really interact with girls your age at parties when there's alcohol involved, trying to kind of, you have one goal in mind. And then going to a school where, you're getting math help from a girl in your class, that's just a completely different set of interactions that were kind of foreign to me. It took some time to learn how to properly talk to a woman without malicious intentions.
You're saying just that constant socialization with boys of your own age. It's like being in the Army.
It's limiting. And in that way, I do feel that schools like Landon or Georgetown Prep exaggerate that. The one thing about my son's school is that there is a sister school that is a few hundred yards away. And starting in high school, they intermingle all of not their courses. At the beginning, it's just intermingling all the musicals, the vocal groups, the track and cross-country teams. They're interacting with girls from the 9th grade on. And then junior and senior year, they are taking classes with each other. And I think that makes an enormous difference, as Nat was saying, that they keep them confined, let them run around during middle school, and then they turn them out and help them socialize into people who can interact with women and others in society.
One of the things you also mentioned at the time, Nat, was the sort of maybe worse than misogyny was homophobia, especially in the law.
Yeah, I can't speak to how it is now. I hope it's improved, especially in this current climate that we're in. But yeah, that was, God help you if you were a feminine boy at Landon when I was there.
Why do you think there was such levels of homophobia? Like, is it the same phenomenon of just boys being together and being afraid of being mistaken for a gay person?
No, I mean, 14-year-old boys, was the funniest thing you could call someone was gay. Like, that was it. But I do think, like, there is something to be said for a little bit of the thought that, well, they're just boys being boys, And one of the great things about Landon was in 6th and 7th, 8th grade, if someone was mean to you, you could fight them. If someone pulled a prank on you, you could pull a prank on them. And when you got in trouble, it was just boys being boys, which I actually think helps in a lot of ways, because it's like a fire. You just let it burn through. But once you start introducing money, drugs, sex, alcohol into the situation, and then these boys are doing things that are illegal, and their actions are still being dismissed as, boys being boys.
That's when it
got, that's when I wanted to leave. That's when it got strange. But with gay kids, it wasn't an environment where you even wanted to be known as like Jewish or thoughtful. Like I was Jewish, and it's not, prep is worse, I've heard, to be Jewish. And so when I would read, they would call me like the gay Jew who reads. So like, it was just like,
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I sent you that.
My nickname in 8th grade was Pennies because I was a Jewish student. So naturally, I collected money.
I swear he never told me these things at the time.
Several of my sons suggested that there was some casual anti-Semitism at their school.
Yeah.
And I think prep is worse. Landon, there were a few Jewish students. But the other thing, I mean, I should say, like, when they called me that, like, I wasn't a noble kid. I would say something back, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it does toughen you up. But there is something unique about the culture of the private schools in the D.C. area that is unlike, I have friends who went to all boys schools in different parts of the country, and maybe it's because of what a lot of the parents do to make money, you know, military contracting, lobbying, where morality is
politician.
There was a noticeable lack of morality at this school, and it was taught from the top down. A lot of kids were taught their values from their parents, as most are, and their values were not ones that were respectful to women and, frankly, respectful of anyone.
Do you see that changing at all now, even post-Kavanaugh? Like, is this something that should be addressed, or you just think is inevitable, it won't be addressed?
Honestly, what I would guess would happen, I haven't been at one of these schools in a few years, but is whenever something happened in the news. So when the Duke lacrosse thing broke at Landon, and that Landon was all over the country, and it was a somewhat similar response, maybe not to this level because we hadn't had the Me Too movement and stuff, but there was definitely a questioning of all boys schools, all boy DC area schools, Landon, like the value of a Landon education. And what the response of the school was this is when we bond together, Landon against the world, you know? And so it's not a healthy response where some of your core values are being challenged, and your response is, well, we need to stick together. This is when we stick together. We have our problems, but we want to deal with them in-house. And so that is definitely what I would guess would happen at prep.
Well, the statement from Georgetown Prep, which we read, was very sorrowful and talking about a need for a change in the culture. I mean, who knows if they'll actually do it, but it wasn't we'll all stick together. It was really more like this is really, really embarrassing.
I remember, as I'm sure you remember, when the first news about Duke came out, before it was even clear they were innocent.
Right.
Landon put out a banner where they're right on the highway.
I remember that.
Very busy highway. They put out a huge banner that says, "We support Duke lacrosse."
Yeah.
This was before, you know, they were known to be innocent. And it was just, people would throw rocks at the sign in the school and stuff. And it was just a very strange moment where it was a strange time to be taking a stand.
Okay, Nat, I'm really glad we got you out of there. I'm glad it was good for the earlier years.
Good parenting, Mom.
Well, no, I think, you know, he was ready to get out of there, as it sounds like you were right to be, Nat. But thank you for coming on and mansplaining. You're such a good mansplainer. I guess you got that from your dad.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on.
All right, well, have a great day and evening, Nat, and thanks.
Thanks, Nat.
You too.
Bye. Yeah, well, clearly our sons, Melinda, went to different types of schools.
Yeah, I was a little stunned by some of the things he said about Landon and its parents and so forth, because our school is sort of known for having much more sort of conservative with a small c, traditional kind of parenting.
Your parents
style.
are way stuffier than the parents.
We're very stuffy.
We're very Episcopal, and you all dress so nicely.
We're known for our stuffiness. Yeah. We're proud of it.
Yeah, I remember going to some of these parents' nights and feeling, it's going to sound very catty, I hadn't had enough plastic surgery done to me, and I was maybe 10 years too old to be with my husband. So I think what he says it was pretty insightful, actually.
It was very insightful. I mean, it certainly fits my own perceptions.
Right.
Of the different characters of the private schools around here. And I'm not sure exactly whether there's something unique about the D.C. area. I would imagine you would have a similar sort of phenomenon up in the Manhattan area, for example.
Right. It's probably similar, actually.
Similar, yeah.
Very similar. Well, that's one of the things, and I want to get into this with Emily as well. We think of this culture as the white entitlement culture of white males, you know, they then go into frats. That's at least the caricature we have of it, and is it real?
I think that there are attitudes that are changing, and I would say that in terms of the religious private boys' school, let me point out that an interesting theory was advanced to me by a graduate of Georgetown Prep that I was speaking to last night. And he said he thought that the religious atmosphere actually made it much worse, and it would be much worse than at a public high school. And it's because he thought that the religious aspect inculcates a view of men and women as totally separate entities. And it said it took him a long time to understand that women as people, see women as people, because they were some kind of exotic other species. Now, I don't know that I agree with him.
I think that's more of a Catholic thing.
It might be more of a Catholic thing.
Because that other religions don't have such big a separation, like all male priesthoods. I can tell you that is never an issue at a Jewish school.
It's certainly not an issue at an Episcopal school, since the major religious concern there is global warming. So,
I mean, I guess I would say it would be an issue at a Jewish school because I can't think of any private Jewish schools that are not open to women except yeshivas, and I think you'd have the same. We have the same problem.
You might have the same problem in a yeshiva.
Orthodox,
sex segregated, Orthodox, very traditional, stereotypical views of men and women. On the other hand, and I have seen it at my son's school, and I'm going to have been at that school 20 years by the time. I have seen changes, and I believe recent events have caused my son's school to really aggressively try to police this culture and to actively change the culture. And the religious dimension and the character education that the schools offer as part of their curriculum is actually a very good vehicle. They will go in there and say, this is morally wrong. Your moral duty is to treat women with respect. Your moral duty and your duty to the school is to conduct yourselves like gentlemen. And they will not hesitate to expel students for off-campus behavior that reflects poorly on the school or on their own characters. This is not something that public schools can do.
Well, I think it's not something you can do because we can't make those distinctions. You can't make rules that are different for boys or girls anymore. We can't truly acknowledge the differences or the distinctions between the sexes. Another big topic that we talk about here. In any case, let's bring Emily on and we can talk more about this. Emily, welcome back to the Femsplainers.
Great to be here.
Yeah, well, we always love having you. Last time we had you on was to talk about Harvey Weinstein and all manners of sexual perversions, which was an incredible episode. But now we want to talk about something that you also know a lot about, which is everything we've seen this past week and learned about the culture of Georgetown Prep and other schools like it in 1982. How much does that go on today, and how many of its sort of attitudes of these types of men, are they still prevalent? That's where we want to start the conversation. What have been your thoughts this past week, knowing what you know about today's campuses?
Until you, Danielle, I have been so grateful that I haven't had to publicly share my thoughts because it's due of confusion. I think a lot of people are feeling that way. As for the culture on campus, I've been writing for the past several years about the culture that's risen up around what's called Title IX. This is the federal law that prevents discrimination in education. And it has been used to address, under the Obama administration, address very aggressively sexual assault on campus. Absolutely necessary and worthy goal. But my reporting showed this was one of those unfortunate overcorrections. Systems were put in place that were just grossly unfair to the accused. And one of the most concerning things to me was the drastic ratcheting up of the definition of what is a sexual violation. Rules about sexual engagement that required every touch, every time, even between ongoing partners, must be explicitly approved, or else later, any time later, someone can make an accusation against another, I thought was not helpful. It over-polices sex, and it gets innocent people caught in trouble. All that said, there absolutely is a culture of binge drinking. I mean, we see endless streams of piggish, gross behavior in that drunk zone that we have seen Brett Kavanaugh described as inhabiting. A lot of bad stuff happens, and that has not changed. I don't see that anything's changed from what was described as weekends of keg parties and extreme intoxication. That's still standard on many campuses.
Well, just before you came on, I found a chart that shows that binge drinking, at least amongst high school students, was at an all-time high in, as you can imagine, 78 to 82, and has gone down. And as Melinda pointed out, well, the drinking age got raised as well, which may have helped. But you're saying you still see in these types of behavior, which for better or worse, Title IX may have been trying to address even in a ham-handed way.
Right, absolutely. And it's an interesting question. Did changing the drinking laws help or hurt? I think, it very likely has helped in the drunk driving realm, but that's also been kind of a social revolution. It used to be kind of hilarious and funny to have drunk driving adventures. It's not anymore. No one thinks that's funny.
Remember Dean Martin used to joke about it, like, oh, I got in my car.
Right. No.
It's on like Lappin.
In fact, the whole time he was actually drinking iced tea or something like that, apparently.
But it was a funny joke. It was considered a funny joke.
It was a joke. But young people, I think, have really comprehensively absorbed the lesson of the designated driver. And
well, they use Uber.
Right. So the point I wanted to make about the drinking is that there are lots of people, and I'm one of them, who thinks an unintended consequence has been to encourage a culture of binge drinking, particularly on college. It's always illegal in high school. I'm so old. When I went to college, the drinking age was 18, and I had to check, was my memory right that a bunch of us would get on the bus on weekends, go into Boston. I mean, I literally went freshman year with a friend to the Copley Plaza bar, and we ordered cocktails. And if you are drinking at the Copley Plaza bar, you're not going to have 10 drinks because you
right. That sounds so civilized.
It was so much fun, and we felt so grown up. And vomiting on the bartender wouldn't have made us feel more sophisticated. So the alcohol was there, so we didn't have to drink every drop in the world because it might not be available to us. So I think making drinking illegal for those under 21 has helped encourage this kind of culture. You get drunk in your room before you leave for the party.
Well, there's this thing, and Emily, to what you're saying about drinking is I may get arrested, so I have to be very careful about what I say. But I am one of those mothers, and I pretend I'm French, but over the years, on a weekend or a special occasion, they might get a little tiny drop of wine at dinner. As they've gotten older, they might, in our house, have a beer or something. But it means we haven't made alcohol so forbidden that when they get to these environments, that's all they can do is do this.
You don't want that to be their first experience of drinking and how to handle alcohol responsibly.
Right.
I mean, I think the idea is sort of the European idea of training your children to associate the consumption of wine or whatever with familial, social, celebratory occasions, with food.
But Emily, you also wrote, and you got in a huge amount of trouble. When you wrote this article for Slate, it was headlined, College Women Stop Getting Drunk. You cited a 2009 study of campus sexual assault found, I'm just reading from the article, found that at the time they are seniors, almost 20% of college women will become victims, overwhelmingly of a fellow classmate. Very few will ever report it to the authorities. And the same study states that more than 80% of campus sexual assaults involve alcohol, and frequently both the man and the women have been drinking. Why did you get in such trouble for pointing out that it's a bad idea for women to get incapacitated at these parties around men? Is that sexist?
Because I discovered it is taboo to say there's anything a young woman can do to decrease the likelihood that she will be victimized. The response to that article was absolutely explosive, and I talked about the dangers of binge drinking for both young men and young women. It's just not good for anyone, and I've yet to hear anyone tell me the benefits of binge drinking. But the response was that there isn't anything a young woman can do. And if you say there is, and if she's sexually assaulted, then you're putting the blame on her, which I don't think is the case. And many people wrote and said, here's the article you should write, Rapists Stop Raping. But what people don't like to acknowledge is that on campuses in this binge drinking zone, there's a lot of emergent, unplanned, unpremeditated behavior. People lose control of themselves. People get in blackouts, which means they're not passed out, they're walking, talking, but they are not making memories, so they're not fully conscious of what they're doing. And a lot of bad, regrettable stuff happens there. My point was that to not say women can't drink at all. Find out your limit, enjoy the effects of alcohol, but keep conscious of yourself and the situation you're in, what the military calls situational awareness. When we look at the most infamous campus cases, usually everyone involved is very, very drunk. I mean, the infamous sexual assault cases. And I just felt if you remove that element, a lot of these terrible crimes go away.
I don't understand why encouraging both men and women to drink responsibly and to know their limits is so politically explosive.
Right, but as Emily's saying, it's the same attitude that says a woman should be able to wear a short skirt, should not be exposed to assault or remarks from men, and now they're applying this to girls who are passed out. And yeah, you should be able to say, if I'm a girl who gets blacked out drunk, I shouldn't be raped. I mean, actually, Mark Judge had a story he wrote citing some frat boy where they took, in this one fraternity, girls who had passed out and they posed them in these pornographic poses and took photos of them. Like, horrible things go on, but let's get to what sort of man actually does this, Emily, because most young men are not going to do that to a young woman.
Here's the thing for both men and women. You do things you wouldn't do otherwise because you are in that zone. Now, people drink precisely because they want to lower their inhibitions and feel less self-conscious and maybe feel more sexy and maybe even very deliberately to want to have sex, which can be awkward and embarrassing. So obviously, alcohol is used as a lubricant for that. And the style of drinking that goes on, they quickly pass that point. And I've seen many campus cases that kind of turn on her seeming to consent, but later saying, I couldn't have, I had too much to drink. And we think of these victims as you described, being passed out and being posed pornographically or jumped on. An incapacitated, passed out woman cannot give consent, and if you sexually act upon her, that's a crime. Someone in a walking blackout can be acting and talking in a coherent, purposeful, seemingly purposeful manner and not be making memories of this. So you see lots of cases where literally there will be a text trail. Meet me in my room, bring a condom, she texts, and then later says, I woke up, he was next to me, I never invited him. Well, you have a text that says you did, but as far as campus rules are concerned, they often hold the young man responsible for his alcohol consumption and behavior, and the young woman not at all responsible. This is where things get really murky and sometimes unfair, and that's the zone where I'm talking about. If you want to avoid these kind of situations, keeping conscious is one of the best ways to do it.
But I think the lesson has begun to percolate to young men, because one of the things that my younger son told me is that it's best just to stay away from drunk girls for this very reason. And the other thing that I learned is during the Obama Title IX initiative that caused such issues on college campuses, my oldest son was in a fraternity. One person was designated as the party monitor who could not drink. And their main responsibility was to make sure that no one consumed alcohol to excess. And he said most of his job consisted of keeping 99-pound girls from drinking so many shots of vodka that they passed out, poisoned themselves with alcohol, and that often they had to stop their drinking and provide 2 escorts home to make sure that there was no implication that anything untoward happened. They were even involved at one point in picking up a passed out girl on the neighboring fraternity's lawn to make sure that she was safely taken home. So these lessons have percolated to them, and there is a certain amount of wariness now about what a very lightweight girl trying to drink and chug alcohol at the same rate as a large 200-pound athlete sitting next to her, that could lead to bad consequences.
But can we go to the question I was trying to say originally, but what sort of man, drunk or not drunk, does take advantage of a girl in that situation? This past week, I'm sure I wasn't the only wife who looked at their husband and said, I know you never, of course, would have taken advantage of a girl who was drunk, but can you imagine doing it? Can you imagine anyone you know at that time doing it? And aside from looking horrified at me that I could even ask that question, he said he just felt it was inconceivable that young men, 16, 17, 21 are some of the most romantic creatures. They're always the one writing the soppy sonnets. And the turn on to a young man is that the woman wants him, that the idea that you want to force a woman to do something or take advantage of her in that state, that is not a natural or normal male desire.
But there can be young men. It's like the sociopath next door.
But that's right. But that's what we're saying. It's not all men.
Yeah, no, not at all. It's often boys who grow up in very dysfunctional family. Perhaps they have parents who have alcohol abuse problems, and there's an abusive family dysfunction relationship, and that can completely screw up their normal interactions with women, and they really don't know where the line is.
So when we're seeing these things happen, as Emily says, it's the danger zone is when a girl seemingly gives consent and doesn't, and that's just a perfectly innocent boy who feels, I guess, misled.
But there are very sexually aggressive young men who cross the line.
Right, and that's really the group of people we're talking about.
And they tar other men.
Right.
Please join the Femsplainers.
Yes, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or your favorite podcast hangout.
And follow us on Instagram at the Femsplainer Podcast.
And find the Femsplainers on Facebook and Twitter at Femsplainers.
And learn all about us at femsplainers.com. Thank you.
Yeah, Femsplainer.
We're talking to Emily Yoffe, who is a contributor to The Atlantic and the HuffPost Highline.
Emily, you had an interesting piece, too, also about the question of race in campus sexual assaults. We've been looking at this, from the Georgetown Prep perspective and other cases where we look at this as the person who perpetrates this typically is that entitled white athlete, like the guy at Stanford, who the woman behind a dumpster. But you found something else when you looked into this, which you wrote about for The Atlantic.
Right. Well, you're talking about Brock Turner. He was a swimmer. He sexually assaulted after a party. He was, as they say, very drunk. She, by the time they were outside near the dumpster, had passed out, and he was found grinding on top of her and was arrested and convicted. Not of rape, but sexual assault. There was a lot of commentary saying, there's a picture of him. He's blue-eyed blonde in a blazer. This is the face of campus sexual assault. This is this elite athlete, frat boy who thinks he can get away with anything. But my reporting over the years showed that an extremely concerning, disproportionate number of young men of color, sometimes foreign men, often African-American men, get accused of sexual assault on campus. No one wants to talk about it. There are no statistics, but in talking to people who deal with it, they often say, yes, this is a problem, but really people don't even want to address the problem. And in talking to people who deal with it, they talked about, one of the things, you come to campus and you are encountering people from different backgrounds and races. It's exciting and there's a lot of sense of taboo crossing, but it also, one Ivy League professor who's dealt with this told me, it also becomes somewhat easier to see this person as the other, and if you feel wronged in some way, to make an accusation. In my story, I describe a really horrifying case at the University of Massachusetts, a young Black engineering student, the son of African immigrants, who was at a fraternity party, was acquainted with this young white woman. She was totally the sexual aggressor. We know this because she wrote an account of the evening. She initiated kissing with him. She initiated performing oral sex on him. Neither of them took off any clothes. He didn't do anything to her, but her friends found out she was up there having a sexual encounter with him and started teasing her, and she accused him of sexual assault. He ended up having to leave the university, having a physical and mental collapse. He brought suit in a very rare thing. He won his suit against the university, and he was eventually able to enroll in another school after being out of school for a couple of years. But it was a really stark case of just a terrible accusation with this racial element that the school didn't even want to deal with.
When you say no one wants to talk about it, you're also referring to the fact that the horrible racial history of Black men being wrongly accused of having sex with white women. That's just the worst kind of history you can maybe evoke. How is the race playing into these situations in terms of people not wanting to deal with it specifically?
Well, you're exactly right. There is this really hideous racial history that kind of looms in the background. The overwhelming majority of lynchings came about because of an accusation that a Black man had touched, raped, looked at, whistled at a white woman. Whether any of it was true or not, often it was not. So that was the justification. So that is bubbling in the background of this stuff people don't want to talk about. I've spoken to several young Black men and even some of the families who've been through this. It was obviously a scalding experience, but I talked to one mother of a Black man, freshman at college, who was accused, found responsible, and later he got a lawyer and got it reversed. And she said, this was the most racist experience, she went up for his hearing, of my life. And I feel I had let my son down because he grew up in a mostly white community. His high school girlfriend was white. Most of his friends were white. And I didn't prepare him for the real world. I didn't think this would be the real world for him, but it was. None of us are ever going to be the same.
Could you explain a little background in terms of how the person in question in this case, she initiated much of the sexual contact? What was the theory of why it was constituted an assault?
Because she said so.
You're saying that Blacks are being disproportionately targeted for it. It's not that they're committing these acts disproportionately, but they're being targeted. And you cite a person who brought a race discrimination complaint against Colgate, that she said believes that men of color, again, I'm quoting from your article, especially foreign men of color, students from Africa and Asia, were uniquely defenseless when charged with sexual assault, typically lacking financial resources, a network of support, and understanding of their rights. So it's also foreign students. So am I interpreting that right?
Well, it's not that the school targets, consciously deliberately.
Yeah, sorry, wrong word. Yeah.
This. These cases arise out of some sort of complaint. And in the case Melinda is describing at UMass, where you say, well, how did this even happen?
I just don't understand what her motivation is to make up this story.
Well, she wouldn't talk to me, but in her description, it's clear they had this sexual encounter at a house occupied by students. They were on the top floor. People knew they were up there. One of her friends had called her during the party looking for her, and she said, I'm up here with him. So when they both came down, there was teasing about, oh, what happened? What was going on? She doesn't say my embarrassment was my motivation, but that teasing was upsetting to her. And shortly afterwards, she said she was a resident assistant, so had all sorts of training in Title IX and campus sexual assault, and said, I started to realize that I didn't like what had happened. I didn't want it to happen. And I realized I was sexually assaulted.
Regrets on the morning after.
Well, by her own account, that's what it sounds like. But once she made a formal complaint to the school is not in a position to say, we've read your complaint and there was no sexual assault. We have counseling, we have services. If you're upset by what happened, we can help you in some way, but we're not going to investigate and bring a case against this young man. But the machinery starts working, and that's what happened.
Well, also, institutions are petrified.
In this discussion, this Kavanaugh started discussion, really the issue is kind of the opposite of people who don't speak up. We're hearing this overwhelming number of women of all ages. Christine Blasey Ford has brought up an incident from 36 years ago, which, until recent years, she'd never told anyone. So there are all sorts of currents at work here, and one of them is now women saying, I never said anything to anyone.
Right. And that's actually, I would say that that's not uncommon in a way that these false, or call them overblown accusations that we've been discussing, actually are kind of denigrating or taking away from real issues of rape, where I think women are very reluctant. And it's because if they have a conscience, they feel they drank too much, they allowed themselves to be taken advantage of. I mean, these things all go through a victim's mind, even if it's completely wrong, that she was taken advantage of. I worry about that. And I think what's been important about this past week is that side of these sexual assaults coming to light, that this does happen. You're suggesting that it's maybe as bad as it was in 1983?
I think it's absolutely the case that women who are sexually assaulted very often don't say anything, do anything, or bring an action, because they are not wrong that doing so will be its own hellish experience. Right. However, we try to construct things to make that as little hellish as possible, it is going to be a bad experience to report, repeat your story over and over, confront the asked questions. We must have some process, and there's really not a way to remove the pain from that process, unfortunately. So, in some ways, we're kind of on campus in a stew of the worst of all worlds, with people who have genuine claims, or, there's kind of a myth that campuses are beset by many premeditated sociopathic predators. There's really no evidence for that, but they exist. Certainly there are some of them on campus and off. We're grappling with this question of Brett Kavanaugh. Did he do it? Did he commit a crime 36 years ago? How do you hold someone responsible all these years later? There are a lot of questions that are not going to be easy to resolve. And then the part I've been writing about, then in order to address these unaddressed cases, do we go too far?
Well, one of the stories you forwarded me before we talked, you forwarded to Melinda and I, was this completely heart-wrenching story. I was crying at the end of it. It came out recently in the Washington Post about this girl in Texas who was raped by two guys. She was drunk. They took her off from a party. They pretended they were going to go get food, and instead they took her to a shed on a friend's property, and they very brutally raped her. And she came back and she told the mother at the party this had happened. Her mother took her to the police the next day. It was all handled exactly as it should have been handled. Except as this story unfolded, the community turned against the girl because these guys were very popular. They were the football team and the soccer team. The parents kind of resented this, and that whole narrative. Well, she was drunk. She was asking for it. Nobody likes her. She's from a poor background. And her case never got taken up. These guys were never charged.
Yes, that was story in the Washington Post by Elizabeth Bruning, just amazing reporting and just the scalding humiliation of this young woman. It happened, about 10 years ago? So she was reporting on that case and its aftermath. The whole Me Too movement is, so important and worthy. However, as I've written about Title IX, we have to be careful. You don't correct one injustice by creating another. So here we all are now with this case sort of dealing with what do you do with information that's so old and perhaps unresolvable.
It may be impossible to have a fair process for any party involved after a certain amount of decades have passed.
Yes. You can understand that Christine Blasey at the time didn't say anything. And still today, you can understand why young women would choose not to say anything.
Terrible things can happen to you that you just don't even want your parents to know, You just want to forget it. You want to move on.
Well, Melinda, as you pointed out that, and I hope this is true, that the message is getting to young men, no, do not prey on a woman who is evidently drunk, even if she's all over you. No, that's not a good place to be. That's not really consensual. I also think, even today, as you say, yes, maybe she's at a party she's not supposed to be at. She doesn't want to tell her parents. But young women also have seen the cost of reporting, and that's just going to be one of those very difficult issues. So we won't know of every case, and we won't know of some cases that we should know about.
How do you then, and this goes to something a little bit Melinda and I were talking about being able to teach men how to treat women, maybe vice versa. I mean, the head of Georgetown Prep, after this all came out, wrote a statement, and he said it was time to think deeply and long about what it means to be men for others, what the vaunted prep brotherhood is really about. It's time to continue our ongoing work with the guys in developing a proper sense of self and a healthy understanding of masculinity in contrast to many of the cultural models and caricatures that they see. What do you think, Emily?
I think you are the parents of sons, so what are you guys doing?
Yes, Melinda, you have incredibly well-mannered sons.
Well, I think that the problem is, and this is not so much a problem for boys who come from a more privileged background, that they are not given affirmative models how a man should behave. And indeed, how a man should behave is obviously a subject of fraught political controversy. What I believe in is a more traditional view of what a man's duties are to women. But I realize that a younger third-wave feminist may vehemently disagree with me. So it's a very confusing time. And I've told all of my sons, and they all say to me, that it's best to be extremely cautious and especially to avoid all drunken young women, except to help them if you can, but to even be careful with that because that could result in an unwanted accusation.
Beyond protecting yourself, there's no doubt there is sexism and misogyny.
Well, there's a duty to intervene as well, to speak up, and I think that that's something that can be taught to young men as well as young women.
This is a larger social question of social attitudes between men and women. When I was a little girl, the health wanted ads were male, female. I mean, it was the name Dean Martin came up. I mean, imagine a show with a guy drinking and smoking surrounded by the ring-a-ding girls. So there's always going to be tension between the sexes and, even obviously sometimes hostility and attraction and fear between the sexes. But Danielle, you were talking about this kind of shorthand frat contempt for women that we see.
This may arise from fear also.
I was going to say that I think the modern fraternity, for whatever it was, and aside from there obviously being bad fraternities, maybe it's the safe space for young, decent guys at college. There's this new book that's come out called The American Fraternity, which is a book of photographs by a guy named Andrew Moisey. It was actually during the 80s. His brother was a member of the fraternity. He was allowed to go in and actually photograph the secret rituals. So there's a lot of pictures of men puking and doing weird things to each other. But in the end, he said, I don't think that any of the people in the fraternity will feel that my book represents the entirety of their experience. I want to caution people against seeing it that way because most of being in a fraternity is totally innocent. Most of what a person does is sits around, talks with friends, plays video games and goes to class. And I think that's really probably...
Yes, it's actually fairly boring.
And messy and gross.
Also, I think we see actually a lot of misogyny, especially on the internet, in the manosphere. And there's just a lot of embittered, disillusioned young men out there who have actually had those romantic notions that as teenagers that your husband was talking about and are very badly hurt by their college girlfriend or their high school girlfriend whom they completely idealized. And they don't know how to handle it. They're very disillusioned. So my oldest son told me, I just wish there were rules. We knew exactly what was expected. It would make things so much easier. And so alcohol is being used as a substitute to replace what used to be in place.
Sparkling conversation,
yes.
Dancing. Polite.
I have to say, Danielle, your husband sounds like a very poetic, romantic man, maybe kind of idealizing or extrapolating.
Maybe he wrote a lot of poetry, bad poetry that he wouldn't show me now. Anyway, Emily, thank you as always for coming on. Thank you for calling in from Boston, where you are this week.
It was delightful to talk to you.
And yeah, thanks for helping us understand this just a little bit better.
Thanks, Emily. It was fascinating.
Mr. Wormer tried to shut us down, but he fell and he broke his crown. He didn't know about the Delta storm. He came in handy, we were sure he was gone. At the old house.
Well, that was a very interesting discussion, Melinda. What did you think?
I thought it was very interesting, and I was most distressed by the disparity between the horrifying cases, such as the one you discussed in Texas about the woman who was brutally raped and no charges were ever filed, and the town essentially rallied behind her abusers, and the fact that in many other celebrated cases, including the famous Rolling Stone article about the UVA fraternities, the woman later admitted that she made up the whole thing. And both sides, men who are wrongly accused or men who are abusing women, it seems like it's all creating a haze of confusion, and people are afraid to come forward. They're also afraid to interact normally.
Well, Melinda, thank you for coming on as a co-splainer. I
loved being on. I'm a huge fan. Thanks for having me.
I know. I'm glad you're a huge fan, and I'm sure we will have you back to co-splain.
Love to do it. Thanks, Danielle.
We'll have listener feedback next week when Christina returns, and as always, we love to hear from you. Reach out to us via Twitter and Facebook at Femsplainers, or you can email us directly from our website, femsplainers.com.